So let me start this off by first welcoming everybody to this session, where we're going to focus on artificial intelligence, manufacturing, and advanced technologies in Africa. So welcome everybody. Also welcome to our speakers in this session. So the session is going to start now and continue up until about 12 o'clock. We have a little bit more time because the next session will only start at 2 o'clock. So we have 4 papers. So this means that we have approximately 20 minutes per paper and about 10 minutes then for questions and answers at the end of each of the presentations. I'm going to be like a very low-level chairperson. So when I ask the speakers to talk, take about 20 minutes time. Around 15 to 18 minutes, I will send you in the chat a private message. So just check that. I know that once one starts, talking in Zoom, we don't often realize or notice the messages coming in. But then we'll have some time for discussion after the presentation of your papers. I also want to suggest that we do it in the order in which it has been presented on the program. So the first speaker will be Darius Ogutu, followed by Doreen and Peter Paul. Then Jacques and I will present our paper, which we will share. And then we'll have a paper by colleagues Odolaro, Adekboye, and Kayumba on the economics of mobile apps. So if that is in order with everybody, let us then, without any further ado, proceed. Let me just say, maybe for a small little introduction, we had also, as the conveners of the session, thought just maybe to say 1 or 2 things about our motivation for the session. And then I also want to give, John, one of the conveners, just 2 or 3 minutes just to, say some welcoming words from his side. As John is not presenting a paper during the session, but John is doing very interesting things on the cutting edge of AI and data science in Africa. So I think it's also would be very appropriate for him to say a few words about the things that he's doing. So we have the session on really cutting edge technologies in Africa, and we have seen with mobile that Africa has leapfrogged in many instances. So in financial tech, Africa is in many ways leading the world, and this has great potential to have an impact on development and growth in Africa. In fact, the recent paper in Nature magazine dealt with the potential impacts of artificial intelligence on reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And the interesting thing about this paper was that it's not unambiguously good news. AI can help with a large portion of the Sustainable Development Goals, but there are also trade-offs. There are also Sustainable Development Goals whose achievement may actually be negatively affected by the rollout of artificial intelligence. And we know that we've also seen during this pandemic that whereas technology can be very helpful, we can for instance have the Africa Knows conference in this virtual manner, and people from all across the world can now talk at the same time. But we have also seen things like miscommunication, false news, etc., cyber attacks, insecurity. What we call awful AI is really becoming a problem, and some of that has also been relating to issues of data privacy, data ownership, and now with the African trade, free trade movement and increasing free trade, we have also seen explicitly the big digital platforms, Google, Facebook, etc., suddenly expressing a huge interest to be active in Africa, to be able to harness data and build their business models driven by AI on this huge data source. And of course, with very few countries having ratified the Malebo Convention on data and cyber security, there are lots of difficulties and potential pitfalls going forward to be able to optimally make use of AI for the greater good in Africa. So that was our motivation. And we also want to link that specifically with the manufacturing sector. And as Jacques and I will explain, there is a very negative narrative that Africa is deindustrializing and cannot industrialize, and actually that technology is now so fast that Africa should all but give up on manufacturing. And we believe that's wrong, and we will argue our case in this session. So on that note, setting the tone, John, I want to ask you if you can maybe, in 4 or 5 minutes, just give us a little bit, from your perspective. You've been very active as an entrepreneur in various institutions in Africa, how you what your perspective is on AI and how you see the different contributions of the different papers in this session contributing for us to make a little bit more sense of where we should go in terms of also, as the theme of this conference is decolonizing minds, how we should approach the development of AI in Africa. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Wayne. It's a pleasure to be here. I think one of the key things also to say a quick hello to Dr. Jacques Ludic, who's also a mentor of mine and a great friend in this journey of artificial intelligence in Africa. In my role, I wear two hats. I'm a director at the Create Center, the Nelson Mandela University in Arusha, which is a PhD university and master's, basically focused on how do you use smart technology to really drive change in what we call real life situations in agriculture, environment, marine, and also in the areas of life and biosciences as well. Then the other part is I'm also the founder for the AI Center of Excellence here in Nairobi as well, which is an institute focused on developing AI engineers across 6 R&D factories in Africa that we're building. One of the things that I think the interesting thing that you had mentioned was around manufacturing, just really quickly, because just largely, we are beginning to see some information coming around from the Manufacturing Association of Kenya, for example, around where the potential use cases for smart technology in automation and efficiency would be for them, and how that efficiency and automation can then result back into one very interesting thing: job creation and less job losses. And this is, one of the big areas that I hope Jack and Wayne will touch on when they talk about, the manufacturing space, especially demystifying and colonizing the minds of people. What we're doing here is in the area of one of the first things that we started was basically to, train 1,000 AI engineers. So we're converting them from data scientists, which is where they have the regular into junior AI engineers, because we see there's a dearth and lack of true AI engineers. We do have quite a number of data scientists, but true AI engineers who can really build real solutions that can actually effect these changes. So we started in this program last year, and with the support of the government here in Kenya, and we're rolling that out. And the other thing as well that we're seeing is, also in research and development, which is very focused in building solutions that then, can become IP that can be used for public good and public service as well, especially in the areas of agriculture. And we're seeing that there is literally very few real R&D centers here, which is where the Nelson Mandela University becomes interesting, because a lot of the work there is to researching into real use cases of using some of the materials and solutions that we have to actually create change. So we're involved in hydroponics projects, for example, which basically we're now using a number of different data sets to begin to build models around how we can, grow a certain type of seed that will survive the harsh terrain of the new climate conditions that are happening. And this is largely driven by, a huge amount of data sets and the models that we then apply from an AI perspective to begin to redesign these seeds that we can give to farmers that can then survive, some of the conditions that we're currently seeing. And this is all part of the R&D project that we're working on at the Nelson Mandela University. Another thing that we're also very keen on is in the area of health. So again, we're developing a number of imaging-based techniques that allow us to create faster and more precise information in the healthcare space, especially public healthcare, where you have a dearth of doctors and where you have very little infrastructure. How can we use, some AI to optimize decision making and give, quicker and faster decision once we curate the data in a way that allows the healthcare professionals to also access this information in real time. Obviously, financial services is a big one, which is one of the big things here. We were with the data commissioner here in Kenya yesterday, where we were discussing the role of AI in data protection and, making sure that decisions are being made that are not stopping the growth of this, smart technology type companies because of the amount of data sets and also the access to data and the problems around privacy and the biased nature of some of the things that could be created as well. So which kind of brings us into the whole ethical or non-ethical or biased nature of AI itself. So, when I look at the continent, I think there is a huge, with my experience over the past, 5-6 years since I moved back from Ireland, there is a huge opportunity for, using AI-driven technologies and AI-driven solutions to actually create, quick, efficient values around some of the lower value chains that we talk about in terms of automation, efficiency, recreating wealth, and managing job creation. And at the same time, I think it's also important that we don't get too far behind in the area of deep tech and R&D, where we then really look at creating solutions that could, IPs that could drive change and also, provide service for the rest of the world. Because I think one of the biggest problems we sort of see here is when we talk about Africa with things like smart technology, we still reference it to, yes, the common man, the little things that are happening, and we sort of try to steer away a lot of our younger people from really applying their scientific mind, to solving some really interesting, world class problems as well, especially in the area of environment and climate change. So this is some of the things that we're working on at the Institute and also at the Nelson Mandela University, and obviously with MIIA, with Jack as well too, in regards to how do we build 6,000 AI engineers in Africa over the next 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Yeah, that's a great way to start the session. And I think you have outlined to us, the opportunities, but also the challenges. Maybe I can just ask you one final short question. And that is also regarding the entrepreneurs. So I'm going to allude in my presentation a little bit to the tech startup scene and the greater flows of venture capital going into AI type of startups. You've also been involved in this a little bit, so I would be very curious to understand also your take on what's happening, and do we also see, from the financial side? So we have you've mentioned the human capital side, the AI engineers, but do we see something similar that we need maybe from the financial capital side?
Yeah, I think one of the big things, people like Jack, yourself, might have to show the world is there is value in investing in AI-driven startups in the continent, because there's a lack of it completely. And I don't think most, we have a lab here where we grow startups, AI-driven, and, we're probably one of the first few ones that are very focused on pure AI-driven startups. But what we're seeing is like a lot of the investors or the financial money, they don't really believe yet that we can develop AI-driven solutions out of the continent and AI-driven solutions for our entrepreneurs, because we still look at, development of technology to solve problems from Africa having to be quite rudimentary, that, let us solve the problem of the local woman on the street or the one farmer. And these are all problems. But if you think about it, if you have AI-driven startups that solve these problems at the technology level, what it means, it actually creates quicker and faster value for that one common woman or that one farmer. And you can actually, it's a cascading effect. So you can't do one without the other. So we're really struggling in that space because we don't see, in Ireland, there's a huge amount of investment in AI-driven startups in Holland, in Germany, in the US, a little bit in South Africa. But if you remove South Africa, none in the rest of Africa. And that is, categorical.
Thank you very much, John. Well, we'll start with the program. I don't see Darius Ogutu with us at the present time. Unless I miss you, Darius, you can just shout out. But while we wait for Darius to join us or not, I'm going to ask Doreen. Doreen, you'll have your time to your presentation now. You're going to talk on the ethics of AI and Ubuntu. It's indicated that the paper is co-authored with Peter Paul Verbeek. Maybe you can indicate the authors of the paper and where you are attached and your interest in the topic. But please go ahead. The platform is yours.
Thank you, Wim. Peter Paul Verbeek is going to join in hopefully 5 minutes because he had some other meeting that he had to finish up. So I will start with the presentation and then he will join at the end of the presentation. We intended to co-author the paper, but Peter Paul is a very busy professor and he also works at the UNESCO Commission of Ethics of Science. So we didn't really join forces in the paper, but he will join on the presentation. And then he will enlighten a little bit about UNESCO process of drawing up ethical guidelines for artificial intelligence. So I will share a presentation, but I'll first introduce myself. Why am I here? I'm actually not an expert on artificial intelligence. I'm by profession a diplomat. And by hobby, I'm a scientist. I did my PhD in law and development studies. And that also involved some African philosophy. So I'll go into that in my presentation. And where did my inspiration of working on Africa come from? That is because I was a student at the University of Cape Town back in 1994. And there I learned about the philosophy of Ubuntu, and it stayed with me for the rest of my life. So I will now try and share my screen with you. So I titled my paper, Artificial Intelligence and African Philosophy of Ubuntu. Maybe some of you, I really don't need to explain Ubuntu because you're African and you probably know it better than I do, but I'll give you the explanation as I have read it in the literature and experienced it myself while living in Africa. And my subtitle is Ubuntu Relationality and Humanization versus Alienation of Artificial Intelligence, ? I like the picture that I've put on the front because this is the consultation for the Sustainable Development Goals and then the cultural dimension of it. And I like the way people are seated in a Ubuntu palaver way of discussing what the relationship is between the SDGs and culture. That on the picture. So I started, I get my inspiration from the PhD I did in 2017 with the University of Tilburg and the University of Amsterdam. And I titled that PhD Development as Service. And I'll briefly explain why I titled it that way and how it relates to our topic of artificial intelligence. So I studied 3 philosophical traditions. One was Buddhist happiness of Bhutan or gross national happiness. The second one was Ubuntu in South Africa. And the third one was the Native American idea of buen vivir or good living in Latin America, and specifically Ecuador and Bolivia. And I related that to the Sustainable Development Goals. So how did I get involved with artificial intelligence is actually because I also worked as a UNESCO coordinator in the Netherlands. And UNESCO is drawing up ethical guidelines for the topic of artificial intelligence. And Peter Paul Verbeek was a member of the National UNESCO Commission. So then I thought, why not see if there's any literature on African philosophy and AI? And I must say, I only found 2 articles. So I think we have still some space to explore this topic. Development of service was, as service was the title of my PhD. Why did I choose that title? It's because we often talk about development in terms of economic growth or the gross national product. We sometimes talk about development as freedom when we follow up Amartya Sen, who talks about how we can actualize our human rights and human freedoms. And when I studied these 3 philosophies from the Global South, they very much talk about life as mutual aid or reciprocity. So I put that together as the term service. So I said development as freedom was a progress from the idea of development as economic growth, but development as freedom, as Amartya Sen formulated it, is still a very individualist concept of development. So these 3 philosophies of the Global South are basically, in a way, opposed to modernist notions of development. And why am I talking about that? It's because we are talking about a society and the economy in which we are embedding the AI technology. So if we take modernist notions of development to their extremes, then the characteristics of that is sovereignty of humans over their environment. So we have an object-subject relationship with our natural environment. It's very much individualist oriented. It talks about freedom and rights rather than duties. It's about the market driven by self-interest and a belief that the market will lead to collective welfare, private property, meritocracy, so rewards based on merit. It has a materialistic point of view of life. It talks about quantification of value and instrumentalization of labor. So the labor is there also for the market and production processes. I already talked about development as freedom, because development as freedom, Amartya Sen developed his capability theory, in which he basically said we should reformulate the purpose of the economy to the question of how do I live the life that I value. So it's a more human-centered, opposed to growth, economic-centered way of looking at the economy, but still in an individualist perspective. So when we go to the philosophy of Ubuntu, the philosophy of Ubuntu can be known through either grammar or through the African proverbs. So in colloquial speech, as I learned it in South Africa, Ubuntu means I am because we are, or I'm a person through other persons. So it's a collectivist relational worldview. But if you take Ubuntu, and I also didn't know that, if you take it in its very deep philosophical sense, and we look at the grammar structure of, in this case, Nguni languages, then the word Ubuntu is composed of two syllables, namely Ubu, or actually three, Ubu and Natu. And the word Bu means abstract being, and the word Natu means life force being. So together they form the word Ubuntu. So if you move to the right of the slide, you can see that Ubu also means enfolded being before it manifests. So there is an idea that there is an abstract being that only manifests through Natu, and Natu, the life force. So Natu also means temporarily having become. So this signifies that Ubuntu is much more than only I am because we are. It refers to the continuous motion of the unfoldment of the universe. So when I try to understand the concept, I try to visualize it also because it helps me understand it. So what I did is I made a black circle, and that signifies the abstract being before it manifests. And I put the life force being here in the yellow stripes in the middle. And you can see that a lot of words in African languages, Nguni languages, end with the syllable Natu. So Kintu, Hantu, Kuntu, Muntu, it all ends with Natu. And that means that all of the abstract beings like Muntu, a person, is Mu in abstract, and it's fired by the life force into life. So it's Muntu. The two life force also connects all of these words together, and there is an exchange between living beings. That's the concept. So if we look at the concept of humanity, which is the purple circles below, the word Muntu or Bantu, people, consists actually not only of the people living now, but it also consists of the living dead or the ancestors, and it consists of the people who are yet to be born, the unborn or the future generations. So the idea of community in Ubuntu is much larger than we understand community in the West. So it's the people living now, the people who came before us, and the people who are coming after us. And in that sense, it's also related to the nature around us through the life force. So talking about nature, Ubuntu connects human and nature. And you can see that, for example, in a word which is a Sotho language, is Seriti. And Seriti means that there is a field which connects all living beings. So you could connect it to the idea of Natu. And if you want to rationalize it, you could say that care for one another implies also caring for the physical nature as well. Without such care, the interdependence between human beings and the physical nature would be undermined. Now, we can also know the significance of African philosophy through African proverbs. And there are many, many proverbs. So Ubuntu is a very large, expensive concept, but I'm just going to pick two of them. And one is related to the economy, and it says that if faced with the choice between wealth and the preservation of life of another human being, one should choose the life of the other. So in other words, in African philosophy, sharing goes above wealth, and the whole of life is centering around mutual aid. This is why I termed my PhD development as service. So the purpose at the end of the day of development is to service one another. So this redefines the place of the economy in society, and it orients the economy towards solidarity, community, inclusivity, and reciprocity. And the ultimate goal of Ubuntu is basically what Mogobe Ramose terms moto fatso. And moto is another word for muntu in Sotho language. And it means moto fatso, that we are aiming at a continual humanization in African philosophy. And that also means that, for example, in education, the goal of education is to grow in your moral personhood. So you are born as a baby and you grow into your moral personhood during your lifetime. And that also means that elders have a very high respect because they have had more opportunity to grow in their morality. Now, the importance of the humanity as a whole is also symbolized in the African proverb that says that no single human being can be thoroughly and completely useless. So that means that the community of people, whether people are criminal or they're ill or they have some sort of handicap or they're demented, they're all part of humanity and they all have a purpose to serve. And it also means that Ubuntu philosophy is very much geared towards truth and reconciliation and forgiveness and restoring the harmony of the whole. Now, we're going to come to our subject of artificial intelligence. And rather than giving answers, I prefer to pose a few questions. And the questions relate to how AI is geared to moto fatso, or is artificial intelligence also its purpose, this continual humanization that in African philosophy is so central. So does it contribute to continual humanization? I can't read my own slides because I have you here. Just gonna put my, wait, sorry. Right. So does AI mend the current flaws in the economy and society, or does it accelerate them? So the G20 talks about the opportunities of AI and it talks about the risk. And Wim already mentioned some of them. The opportunities, of course, are in increasing efficiency and productivity, and it's taking over tasks from human beings. At the same time, the G20 points at the risk, like there is, other than labor increase that John says he hopes for, there may also be labor redundancy because certain jobs will disappear. It may lead to higher inequalities because the people who have the capital now in our modernist economic system are the ones who can also afford to employ AI and get rid of certain jobs. And therefore, there will be more power concentration if we're not careful in how we distribute the benefits of the AI and who owns the AI. Then, of course, Wim already mentioned it, there are risks of military uses, cybersecurity, issues of privacy, and other ethical issues like bias. And, of course, the fact that there is a danger of new digital divides, poor against rich, but also men versus women, and those who have access to internet and those who haven't. And that already has become very clear now in the COVID crisis when everybody is doing homeschooling and homeworking, and those people who do not have the digital devices are left out. So there's the need for AI capacity building, as John already mentioned. So the AI in current economy or in the current economic system, which is based on the principles of modernization, also risks exacerbating existing inequalities, and it risks further dehumanization if AI leads to alienation between humans and other species. So I'm going to make a few more remarks on specific issues. For example, the idea of transhumanism. The idea of transhumanism, in my perspective, is also rooted in modernism ideas, because it basically proposes that robots can replace humans, or at least create genuine intelligence, which they are calling strong artificial intelligence. And that presupposes that intelligence can be separated from your body, and intelligence is individualized. So this, I think, is an idea that's very much derived from René Descartes' idea of cogito ergo sum. So I think and therefore I am. And if I would oppose that to African philosophy of Ubuntu, I would say African philosophy of Ubuntu would propose that we feel connected, and therefore I am because we are. So that is a very different proposition from I think, therefore I am. So Ubuntu takes the meaning of life from living through other people and connectedness and feeling engagement with others. And therefore, from this point of view, intelligence may be collective, and it may be a product of relational being. So the question is, can robots reproduce that relational collective being? And the question also relates to what is actually mind, what is brain, what creates intelligence, and what is consciousness. So some final considerations. Uleanya is one of the 2 or 3 papers that I could find on artificial intelligence in African philosophy, says that robots may aid in weakening social cohesion and social roots. So the question is, are they going to, is AI going to be weakening or strengthening social cohesion, or is it simply only geared towards efficiency, and haven't we really thought about this issue? The second question I can ask from the Ubuntu perspective is, does the technology contribute to equality and inclusion, or does it enhance individual gain when certain people own AI and other people don't? Or certain continents may own AI, or certain platforms like Google and Facebook own certain digital devices and others don't. So somebody also mentioned the issue of care. And in African philosophy, there's a very distinct idea about care and personhood. So elders, as I explained, have an elevated status of personhood because they have, if they have done well and have lived according to Ubuntu, they have acquired more moral personhood. And therefore, in the African philosophy of care, the idea that the younger person looks after an older person also adds to the mutual aid of life, and it constitutes meaning because the younger and the older person can learn from one another. So the idea when we introduce care robotics, and maybe Peter Paul, who has joined us, I can see now, can also add something to that later when he speaks, is there may be resistance in Africa to care robots because of the whole idea of elder care and the elders in society from the African philosophy point of view. So do the care robotics just going to, are they just going to address efficiency, or are they going to address also this continual humanization? So then there's issues of language. A lot of computer programming is in English. As I explained, the entire African philosophy is embodied in language. So are we going to include African language and thus the African philosophy in computer programming, or do we feel that English represents a universal reality? Then there's the question of bias. Will AI replicate existing bias, or will it be geared towards diminishing bias? And this is a very important issue at the moment in the Netherlands, where our cabinet has resigned over tax issues, where they were using algorithms to locate fraud. And it turned out that the algorithms select people with a double nationality and a foreign surname as being the possible frauds. And that has created a lot of negative sentiment in society, and the entire cabinet has now resigned over that issue. So will AI make bias more transparent, or will it make bias more opaque? Then I looked in my paper also at how Ubuntu is reflected in the UNESCO principles for AI. And the UNESCO principles for AI I derived from a report which is called the COMEST report. And COMEST is the Scientific Committee for Ethics, or Ethics of Science of UNESCO. They drafted the report in 2019. And now they are doing a member states consultation worldwide on how countries think about AI and ethics, and they are to publish a guideline in 2021, November, on ethics of AI. So I'm very pleased to announce that we got Professor Peter Paul Verbeek in our midst. He's from the University of Twente, and he is a philosopher on technology. He's a member of the Netherlands UNESCO Commission and also the chair of the COMEST committee who drafted up the first advisory report on ethics of AI for UNESCO in 2017 and on 2019, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm going to leave the floor now to Peter Paul to say something about the principles of UNESCO that were formulated by his commission. And I made a nice slide in which I also relate those principles to the phrases in Ubuntu. So the floor is yours, Peter Paul.
Thank you, Doreen, for this very nice introduction. Yeah, an honor to be here, actually, to speak about an important topic and maybe also to explore together with all people listening now, joining the discussion, how we could maybe improve the idea of doing intercultural ethics, because I think that's what's really needed and what big invasive technologies like artificial intelligence show. And so maybe before going quickly through the list of basic principles, it's good to say that what we try to do at COMEST is to investigate how AI is affecting our society. And the key idea is actually that AI should be seen as a technology of the mind, so to say. And exactly that is what UNESCO is all about. It's science, culture, education, and also communication. It's all elements of the mind. And also, well, you can exactly there, AI does its work. It changes how we understand the world, and also it changes scientific explanation, or there is science also in the algorithms, you could say. It has an impact on culture, on our cultural tastes, and the algorithms that give us music on all kinds of platforms, the forms of creativity that are added to the creativity of artists by artificial intelligence, etc. And they affect culture. So, well, there are many aspects of human thinking, the human mind, that are at stake through AI. And that's what we tried to analyze in order to arrive at the end of the report at a set of, well, basic principles to deal with this in a responsible way. And in the principles, I think we tried to reflect all the voices in the commission. And actually, there are people from all over the globe. In COMEST, there are 18 members, 3 from each of the 6 regions of the world. And it means that some of the principles take roots in more individualistically oriented value frameworks, and some more on a kind of collective basis. And I think that's what you can see here. And so I think it's a very nice way to link Ubuntu principles to what we are saying. But of course, you cannot say that we have based the principles on the ideas of Ubuntu. They are not opposed to it, though, and sometimes they are in line with it. I think in terms like human rights, sustainability, governance, those are really Western terms. So in Africa, the focus is, of course, more on human relations, on future generations, ancestors. So there's a time dimension there that is different, I think, than is reflected in this list of ideas. But other notions, flourishing, responsibility, inclusivity, I think they do resonate very well with the Ubuntu idea of moral personhood, which also consists in taking a form of responsibility towards the community, not only towards individual persons. And well, of course, it's about flourishing. Then the question is it about the flourishing of the individual or about the flourishing of the society, or of the whole, you could say? And that's maybe also where ideas diverge among members within COMEST. And that's maybe also why this list of well, basic guidelines, principles can be read in many different ways. I think in general, the most interesting thing to discuss might be how universal we should try to make such a list. And maybe even the very attempt to arrive at a general list of principles, which should be universal, is already a challenge. Because then, of course, it would imply that we have some kind of a top-down idea, and that we arrive at a set of frameworks that are applicable for anyone, which of course runs the risk of not doing justice to diversity. So one of the ways in which we could tackle this is to try to think in terms of value-sensitive design, where we try to connect ethics to the design of technologies, which is then typically not only top down, but also bottom up, where you try to identify which values can be at stake in a specific community when a technology is introduced. And then not with the goal to say, well, whether we should or should not introduce a technology in that society because of the set of values, but more from the question, how could we take these values into account when we design or redesign a new technology, or when we implement a technology in society, or when we use them. And then what you do is this bottom-up ethics, you could say, ethics from within, as it were, which could connect a list of guidelines that can be based both on individual and universal values to the actual development, implementation, and use of a new technology. To conclude, I think it's really important that we discuss these things now. It's actually maybe in that sense also quite an exciting time, because the new technologies that we are developing now, like AI, have an impact on the entire world. But they comprise everything. It's about social relations, it's about culture, sustainability, gender issues, everything. And that means that we also need to get the whole world around the table to discuss how to deal with these technologies in a responsible way. So the current connection, I think, of more individually oriented frameworks and more collectively oriented frameworks is a very exciting moment also in the history of ethical reflection. I think in the COVID crisis, you see this also within the Western world. From my own small point of view here in the Netherlands, there was a big discussion about, for instance, the COVID apps that we have on our mobile phones, where initially the discussion was a lot about safety, security, around privacy, and now actually the discussion is moving towards forms of solidarity. How can we take care of society with the help of these apps? And that tension becomes much more visible. On a world scale, we see that now as well. And therefore, I think that a next iteration of thinking about the ethics of AI should really not only try to arrive at a list that could apply to anyone, but should try to identify various ethical frameworks, backgrounds, traditions, like the one that we have been speaking about here from the theory of Ubuntu, and see if we can have a discussion at that level, but we try to integrate as many perspectives as possible, not only to unify them within some kind of a Western-oriented framework, but to have an overarching framework where diversity and not universality can play a role. I think I should leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doreen and Peter Paul. Thank you very much for joining us, also Peter Paul, and for giving this last overview, and Doreen for your comprehensive feedback about the application of the Ubuntu concept to AI ethics. I'm going to introduce the time for questions and answers, and maybe misuse my position as a chairperson to maybe ask the first one or two questions to Doreen and to Peter Paul. I was immediately stimulated by the tension between society and the individual that Peter Paul mentioned and referred to. And this is a debate that I think is worthwhile to pursue also in other contexts. If one ultimately asks who is suffering, it's always the individual. Suffering is also on the individual level. We can never say that the Netherlands suffers, because the Netherlands is an intersubjective construction. We construct the Netherlands, like the Soviet Union was a construction which disappeared by signature. The Netherlands cannot suffer, but individual Dutch persons can suffer. So if the locus of suffering is always on the individual, from a philosophical point of view, I'm wondering whether we are not, missing somewhat the real emphasis in trying to put the AI ethics on that of the society or the group. That's one comment. The second comment is that, in terms of ethics guidelines now, we see that in the European Union alone, there are now 290 plus ethical guidelines by various organizations and governments and the EU. Everybody comes up with a set of ethical guidelines. Now, the interesting thing to me is that they basically look very much like the ethical guidelines we have for research in genetics and biology. except now we've added one extra thing, and that is the explainability of AI. We never had the explainability in biology or other sciences. So this is something that, in terms of the ethics of AI, is something that comes a little bit more to the fore. But what I think is really interesting, and for me still very tough how we are going to do that, is that you mentioned your last comment, Peter Paul, was about the diversity of ethical norms, etc. And that's really a very good point, because we see that ethical values differ across the world, but importantly, they also differ across time. We had notions about fairness, and in past times, children would be beaten by a cane at school. We would see that as part of the normal education process. Fortunately, today we don't think that is ethically something that should be done anymore. So if we encode our ethics now and we make our ethics computable, do we allow for the fact that ethics change over time? That's the one problem. The other problem is that machine learning itself, the more data it gathers, it learns. So if you put some ethics into it, it will learn new ethics over time. So you would always, as a regulator or as a government, would have to keep your eye on what the AI is doing, because it's not a static program. You don't program it and it stays the same forever. It will actually learn. And so we had this famous example of this Twitter bot who had to be taken off after one day because he started to insult everybody. It kind of like made up its own ethics, which we thought was not really, the ethics that we would like it to have. So these are just some of the concepts that I see as being complex. Maybe you can reply back on that, but let me now stop and ask if there is anybody else who would like to ask a question or make a comment to this very interesting presentation. We had one question in the chat. Which is, does Ubuntu reflect in contemporary national institutions and structure, example through policy, government guidelines, or cultural programs, or is it all destroyed? How can Ubuntu be brought into the decolonization campaign? That's a question on the chat. So if there's no other questions, then Peter, Paul, and Doreen?
Yeah, I would like to say something first on your first remark that suffering is always individual. I'm not sure if I agree with that, because if you take the African concept of Bantu, of people, that includes the former generations and the future generations. So, for example, there are people who suffer from intergenerational trauma when they haven't undergone the trauma themselves, but it has been transferred to them from their previous generations. So I feel that in Western philosophy, we also sometimes deny the connection that we have with other generations, which is much more present in other cultures like African cultures. And I would really encourage one of the Africans in our audience to maybe comment on that. And then on the question whether Ubuntu is reflected in policies, I looked at that. I wouldn't be able to tell you for the entirety of Africa, but I looked at that in my PhD for South Africa, and it was very much part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. And then it made it into the draft constitution of South Africa, but it was omitted in the final constitution. So that tells you a lot that it was not deemed important enough to put it in the final constitution, whereas it's a very important philosophy for the majority of South Africans. So it was used for the Truth and Reconciliation process, but it is also embedded, for example, in the diplomacy of South Africa, because the white paper on diplomacy actually calls South African diplomacy Ubuntu diplomacy, but they don't really work it out because they just relate it to African Renaissance, African Brotherhood, and human rights and democracy and helping other countries in their development. There is also some implicit policies of Ubuntu, and there is some jurisprudence. So some of the judges of the Supreme Court, like L.B. Sachs, actually did take the concept of Ubuntu because it was there in the draft constitution, and they took a lot of legal decisions on the basis of Ubuntu. For example, not to evict people from their housing, on the basis of property ownership, but put limits to when people could be evicted from their housing. So there are ways in which Ubuntu is integrated in law and in development policies, but it's not very much in the economic policies, which is still very market and private property oriented. But yeah, there is a lot of scope to discuss that also further. It's, for example, also present in some of the environmental regulations of Swaziland, but not in the environmental regulations of South Africa. Paul, you want to add something?
Maybe I'm not sure if I should, or should we first have all the questions? Wim, what would be your suggestion? Would you like my reply now?
It's also what's easiest for you. I know that there are two hands up from Ton and Marie-Louise. I don't know if you want to, before you lose the question, if you've written it down, then it's fine. Then we can take more questions.
Yes, indeed. I've made some notes, so maybe it's nice to hear the other questions.
All right.
And maybe you can also say something on the explainability that Wim referred to, why that was added.
Yeah.
Well, who was first, Ton or Marie-Louise?
Marie-Louise.
Marie-Louise?
Yes, thank you. But I do want to take the opportunity also to raise the attention to, I think it's Dr. Jacques who also has another question. Yes, and he's found the raise your hand button now. Okay. Thank you all very much. First of all, of course, for hosting this session, and then for your introduction, Wim and Doreen and Peter Paul, for your very inspiring words just now. It's always very nice to meet a colleague for the very first time in a setting that was organized by others. So Doreen, I've sent you an invite to connect more in a personal level later on. So I work as advisor on digitalization for development within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And one of the elements that I focus on is on developing guidance on the use of data in the programs that we fund. We stimulate the use of digital technologies and therefore, of course, also the production and use of data. But we are very much aware of the difficult or the different risks that were mentioned in the presentation. Now, what I would like to invite both Doreen and Peter Paul to reflect on is I see a general trend of a lot of organizations and countries to develop these principles. And I think these are, of course, a very good starting point to get that conversation started about how we want to deal with data and AI and the effects it has on equality and on power relations. But what I feel is generally often overlooked is the role of, for example, civil society. So the investment that is needed in local capacity of local actors to continuously monitor and be a watchdog of the often unintended effects of the use of data and technologies. And yes, I'm very curious to hear from your perspective how you feel about that, because for me, one of the reasons is that you want technologies to be shaped by people, of course, but also because no legislation or set of principles can foresee all the future consequences. So therefore, I think this investment in this continuous ecosystem of checks and balances is important. And I'm very interested to hear your perspective on this, and perhaps also some good examples of where you see this happening and what are the preconditions to make that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Louise. Ton, we'll take your question.
Yeah, good morning to all of you. Yeah, thanks a lot for a very, very inspiring talk. In the Africa Knows conference, there's a surprising attention for language, almost in every panel. And I was a bit surprised hearing that the fact that the English language is so important in say, all the basics of AI takes us away from the fact that also AI makes it very much possible to use other languages. And the fact that, for instance, Google Translate now has 15 African languages online, and that linguists are now very much forcing themselves to improve those. And the value of language and really deep thinking about language is also true also clear from the linguistics behind the Ntu, etc. that we heard. So my question is the near future not that many more African languages will become more important in AI work and all types of things you can do with AI?
Thank you very much, Don. Very good question. Jacques?
Yeah, I just want to first of all say to Doreen and Peter Paul, fantastic presentation. It resonates very well with my upcoming book about democratizing AI to benefit all. So those questions that you've got, I've actually have some perspective and proposed answers to some of that. I think it's not easy. And your perspective, just the African Ubuntu perspective, is quite interesting because I've looked at Western and Eastern philosophies, but I think the African perspective brings another spin on the whole thing as well. In terms of the whole thing around, I think Wim, you mentioned also where do you feel suffering and stuff. So I do think we are part of a community, a family. You can have families that feel suffering, or communities or civilizations and stuff. So I think there's that kind of connection. And it's interesting to explore. So I'm still also figuring things out and trying to understand this better. But these kind of things are things that we need to sort out. So it's wonderful to get these different perspectives. My background is more kind of, I've got my PhD in AI, machine learning. I'm technical around building solutions, but I have to think about the ethical things. And I welcome all these different perspectives. So I bring in the book, I'm actually trying to make a lot of sense about all these different perspectives. And I think it's quite important to do collective sense making. And what I propose is also a massive transformative purpose for humanity, and then very specific MTP goals that complement the SDGs. So all of that is covered in the book as well. But anyway, fascinating. I would love to get some of the contents. If you can share some of your articles and books and stuff, that's awesome.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think that's the final round of questions. So back to Doreen and Peter Paul.
Shall I go first then, Doreen? Yeah. Very interesting questions, also really stimulating. So let's hope I can touch on most of the things. Maybe first go back to Ubuntu ethics and the idea of the dynamic nature of ethical frameworks. I think this is typically, of course, a very big discussion within ethics. The people can be afraid that we end up in a form of moral relativism if you allow for moral change, so then anything goes. But of course, we have seen ethical frameworks change in a direction that we think is good. We don't want to go back to slavery. We don't want to undo human voting rights, female voting rights, which is actually quite recent here in the Netherlands. So I think that whole notion of value dynamism is becoming really important in the ethics of technology. Values change under the influence of technologies themselves, which makes ethics of technology quite complicated because technologies affect the frameworks with which they themselves will be evaluated in the future. So that time dimension is gone in Western thinking, but it is all the way there in Ubuntu, and because the ancestors, the future generations are all there in your ethical thinking. And that's actually what I find very, very fascinating and what I would like to do more research on. So how that time dimension could play a fully fledged role in ethical theory. But then, of course, then another danger is on the horizon. You don't want to go into some form of neocolonialism, annexating Ubuntu thinking within Western models and making it a part of a Western approach. So organizing a genuine dialogue where the two can meet, as it were, would be the most important thing for me. And that, well, let me just go through some of the things that I noted down. There was a discussion on explainability, indeed, as something that was added to all the bioethics principles that are still very much alive also in the AI ethics. Indeed, I think explainability for me is maybe the most clear expression of kind of a neurotic desire of people to stay in control, that the individual needs to be in control of everything, right? So there's no trust behind it. It's all about safeguarding, securing things. You want it to, and I think a more an ethics that's based on trust can do other things than only that. So I'm not saying that I'm against this, not at all, but it really focuses on an individual wanting to take control over the environment. It's a very technical way of thinking about ethics, whereas a more collective concern could indeed be about what is needed for a society to flourish and how we could somehow shape the conditions for flourishing. I always like to call that positive and negative ethics. Negative ethics tries to identify the boundaries boundaries and to explain what we do not want, positive ethics tries to shape the conditions for what we do want. And I think, then you have an ethics based on values, which is, I think, more in line with some African thinking. Then what I also found really interesting was the discussion Marie-Louise opened about, civil society versus the principles. The principles also start to irritate many people, right? Yet another list and yet another list. And what do? Nothing. Maybe it makes you feel good that you've written down the principles, but it's all about how we enact them. And I think, what I see happening now is that many organizations try to make them actionable with a very Western concept. But what we are trying to do now here, and I think that links to what you say, is to work on guidance ethics. It's an approach that we have developed last year, and which tries to make a contrast between ethics as assessment versus ethics as a form of accompaniment. So if you assess it, then you stand outside the technology and you say, yes, you can go in, no, you should stay out. But if you see ethics as accompaniment, then you try to do ethics from within and to stand next to the developments and try to understand what it's doing to society. And then actually that can be positive ethics. You can identify the values that are at stake, but it's also bottom-up ethics in the sense that you can then listen to stakeholders, to people in society, to the professionals working with the new technologies, citizens, and then try to, together with them in a form of co-creation, work on ways to implement AI systems in a responsible way in our society. I've come to call it here now citizen ethics, but maybe citizen is also a bit too limited, but it links to the civil society framework that you gave, I think, Marie-Louise. And then very briefly, language, I think that is very important, Tom. It does play a role in our comments report, but that people were really very worried that machine translation would be too poor and there would be too little investments to have adequate forms of realizing ways to make African languages accessible to people who do not master the languages. It's a delicate balance. Are the systems good enough so that people can take part in society in a full way, or will it be a sloppy system which actually would exacerbate the inequalities? And then Jacques, I think fascinating. I hope to read your book. The SDGs are, of course, also very, very interesting, because the SDGs are, I think, one of the rare frameworks that, somehow succeed to have an encompassing framework in which the entire world can somehow recognize itself, avoiding the dichotomy between individual versus the collective. And I think working on a way to connect the SDGs to AI ethics would be a very important step for the future.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much again, Doreen and Peter Paul, for an excellent presentation. We can have a virtual applause. Thank you very much. Well done, and thank you for the questions and discussions. We are moving on to the next paper. Unfortunately, we don't yet have with us two of the paper presenters. So I would suggest at this stage, Jacques, and that you and I take the stage now. So we have a kind of like a presentation that we can share, that we're going to share. I'm going to take the introduction in terms of AI and manufacturing, and then I'm going to stop at some stage and I'm going to give over to Jacques to continue. Hopefully we will sequence this in a way that tells a very nice narrative that flows into one another. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let me see if this works. Can you see my screen?
Yes, you can. Okay,
thank you very much. So Jacques and I am going to talk about artificial intelligence and the transformation of manufacturing in Africa. Which we see as one of the potential important contributions of AI. So if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of structural transformation, in terms of creating jobs for the population, also increasing jobs for young people, so SDG number 8, we see this as all being very relevant in terms of the manufacturing sector. The problem is that there is a very pessimistic narrative that describes Africa as not being able to industrialize through manufacturing. So one argument is that Africa is actually deindustrializing, that it's lost its manufacturing share. And it is often recommended that African countries should focus rather on service sectors and agriculture and sectors with the characteristics of manufacturing, but not actually manufacturing. So there's a recent book by New Farmer and Tarp et al., which talks about industrialization without smokestacks, which seems good from the environmental point of view, but they actually recommend that African countries go more into services and logistics and tourism and travel and transportation and financial services, rather than real making goods that you can drop on your foot. Others are concerned that the new technologies, sometimes they call it the fourth industrial revolution. I personally don't think there is a fourth industrial revolution. It's part of a narrative of the World Economic Forum, but nevertheless, there is definitely a wave of powerful digital technologies, of which AI is one, which is based on data and computing power. And many are afraid that this will create too large gaps to bridge between African countries and leading countries in the technological frontier. And so Africa should not try to engage in this type of manufacturing development. I think what Jacques and I show is that there is quite a different narrative emerging and possible. And in this, artificial intelligence, data, and other digital technologies are playing a positive role. The first point that I want to make, and I've made it a couple of times in the last few years, and I think I just should continue making this point because it's not always, sinking in. But the fact is, if you look at it from a pure statistical point of view, Africa is not deindustrializing. So anybody telling me that manufacturing is a lost cause in Africa, in fact, Africa has had the fastest growth of manufacturing in the world. So if you look at manufacturing value added in constant prices from 1980 to 2016, it's going up. Manufacturing employment, where we have good data available, at least in 18 sub-Saharan African countries, has more than doubled in the last 10 years. If you look at growth in real manufacturing added, it is actually higher in many cases than real GDP growth. And moreover, the trend in manufacturing growth over time is positive. And manufacturing employment as a share of employment in these African countries have actually increased over time from 5 to 8%. So this is contrary to the definitions, all definitions of deindustrialization, either looks at the value added shrinking or the employment shrinking, and actually that both employment and value added in manufacturing should shrink if you want to make the case for deindustrialization. And this is not what we see in Africa. If you look also at the share of employment and value added in these different countries for which we have good data available from, even before 1975 to recently, you can actually only argue that maybe in the cases of Ghana and South Africa, do you see declines in both the share of employment and value added since 1975. But in most cases, you do not see that. Now, the question is, what is the future of African manufacturing? Will we see this positive trend continue into the future? And how will technology change that? And this is really where there is the possibility of what I call multiple equilibria in terms of how this will play out in future. Is it a window of opportunity, or will it actually be an hindrance to further manufacturing development? I think that as Jacques already mentioned, and some of the earlier, Doreen and Peter Paul also alluded to that, within high technology, and then specifically applying it to manufacturing, there is really a lot of opportunities. So the opportunities are that, for instance, the new technologies make manufacturing actually easier, not more complex. It also harnesses African resources and conditions to a greater degree than I would say older technologies did. And these technologies are all relevant for the sustainable development goals. In fact, I referred in my introduction to a paper in Nature of last year, which looked at the SDGs and AI and found that, AI can really make a contribution to most of the development goals. There are also some trade-offs and some possible negative implications, or also what Marie-Louise called some of the unintended consequences that are playing out. And what we also see more than I think that is relevant, and more importantly, is that African entrepreneurs are actually already doing this. We don't need to tell entrepreneurs in Africa that there are opportunities for high tech in creating new jobs and creating value and helping achieve the SDGs. They're already doing that. And Jacques will actually also add a little bit more flesh to this argument and examples of what is actually already happening. Now, I mentioned that one of the benefits of the new technology, including AI, is that it actually simplifies manufacturing. It democratizes manufacturing, if you want to use that word. And you have two types of formats where through manufacturing are really boosted. One is the digitization of processes and production lines and information, as well as the creation of digital platforms that creates markets, but it creates global markets and brings players and agents on different sides of the platform, users and producers together in a global way that creates scale. And that's very important. The other point is that software is, as Thomas Friedman put it very nicely in his book, software is this magical thing that takes each emerging form of complexity and abstracts it away. So the good example is of an app. You have this app on your phone that links with your bank and your bank accounts and your payments. Behind that app is a huge amount of software and programming, but you don't know about it. You don't see that. You just push the button and things happen, right? So it seems like magic because it's abstracts away the complexity. And because we built these apps and these modules of ICT and software and algorithms based on one another, and it's basically also free. So on GitHub, the repository of software, you can take and download various blocks for free, and you can build up, in a modular way, quite complex products and goods and services for almost zero cost. Biggest cost, as John Kamara also indicated, is the knowledge, the entry into this type of way of creating value. Then you have also related to that smart materials, plug and play components for robots, also in molds used in manufacturing. So complexity in molds, which is one of the key things that makes manufacturing so risky. If you don't have a good mold for a part and there's small little cracks in it, you can have your whole production process can run into difficulty. That's largely overcome now by 3D printing. So you can make very good molds, very good kind of like prototypes, and bring it to market much quicker than before. Let me just give you an example of how entrepreneurs in Africa are already using the digital platforms to produce goods and sell that across the world. So you can go onto Kickstarter, and this is a crowdsourcing platform, but there are now also many African Kickstarter is international, but there are many African crowdsourcing platforms. You can get your project funded by crowdsourcing. Then you can hire employees using either LinkedIn or other online labor markets, Guru, People Per Hour, Fiverr. There are lots of them also now in Africa. You can use cloud computing services at very low cost. You can use open source software for your applications and for machine learning. Your software, as I mentioned, you can manage through GitHub online. You can hire programmers to, improve your products and your services by, various online labor markets. You can use, like we do now, Zoom or Skype or Hangouts for organizational communication, QuickBooks for accounting. For translation, you can use DeepL or Google Translate. For business news, subscribe to Medium or Feedly. For marketing, you can go through International AdWords or Bing, Facebook, Instagram. Then if you want to do physical manufacturing, say through 3D printing, say you have a great concept, you do it in an online design, you can even crowdsource your design out there. For say you want to sell tables or you want to sell African masks, you can design that and then you can send it, via Voodoo. It can be printed anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter if a 3D printing farm is in Angola or it's in New York. So Voodoo is in New York. You can send it to Voodoo. They will do the 3D printing what you want on demand as your consumer's demand is good, and it can be shipped by DHL or the postal services right to their home address. And you can market these things on Amazon Web Services or Etsy or many other types of online platforms. And if you do need to meet physically, you can use WeWork or other types of meeting facilities for shared offices and meeting space. So if you look at this type of business model, you can see how easy it is nowadays with very low cost to enter into manufacturing. What you actually only need, what becomes now more valuable, is your creativity and the ideas of what you want to do and how you want to show that. I mentioned 3D printing, so you can see that these molds that you can make by 3D printing becomes much cheaper and much less risky. key. Now, I've also mentioned that that this new technology actually harnesses African resources and comparative advantages actually even better. So if we look at AI, can help to trace products from farm to fork, and complementing that with blockchain can help with the quality assurance and the different checks. We now find that many of the food processing plants in Africa are increasingly using AI for monitoring the workspace, what's happening in the workspace in terms of quality standards. 3D printing can help very small artisans to scale up and to be more efficient and more cheap. Renewable energy can play a big role, of which Africa has huge amounts. Drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, which also operate very often with their remote sensing and their computer vision, using, for instance, AI algorithms to identify soil conditions, do weather forecasting, looking at safety and security, looking at road maintenance, etc. These drones Africa has a competitive advantage in the development of drones. So where I'm sitting, for instance, in the Netherlands, it's so hugely densely populated. You also need to have a number plate to have an unmanned aerial vehicle. If you want to experiment and develop the technology, there's no real space. But you can come into Africa, and there's huge space and rural areas where you can test and put drones really to the test. And see what their capability are. So I think Africa has a real comparative advantage in the development of this technology. And so we see this already being used to a great extent. There are really leading drone manufacturers and applications, for instance, in mining in South Africa and also in agriculture. Then you have also in this Internet of Things, so tracking supply chains across the continent. We see that, for instance, now Ethiopia's coffee supply is completely tracked by Internet of Things and AI applications already. And then we have smart materials in building, in urbanization, which Africa has a huge need of, building smart things in short period of time, using, for instance, bioengineering and biomanufacturing in this type of material. So there are many examples. I can keep you entertained for many hours, giving examples of each of these, and how African entrepreneurs are building them, bringing them to market. Now, recently, one of the things that I've also been working with Jacques is in a project that we are working on that's funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung, that are looking at AI and entrepreneurs in Africa, and specifically looking at data science. And this is an example of what we did last year. So last year we had a competition, a data science competition, as they call it in Africa. And this was done through Zindi, which is the largest data competition platform in Africa. So this works like if you've heard about it globally, there's Kaggle, which is the most famous data science competition. So for instance, when the COVID crisis broke out, Kaggle had this competition, which said, well, if you can make a solution to help us track COVID through AI, we will give a prize. So all computer programmers and AI specialists submit their solution, and the best one gets a cash prize. And so similarly, last year, we launched a Zimnet insurance recommendation challenge. So this competition was, we asked programmers to send in a recommender system for Zimbabwe's largest insurance companies. So for instance, people who are buying certain types of insurance, maybe they would also benefit from other types of insurance. So this recommender engine, this recommender engine is best, say, for instance, if you are looking into Netflix or you've bought books on Amazon, etc. So based on your history, but also on the data of other people, the recommender engine will make you recommendations. And so we did this competition to do this for Zimnet, offered a 5,000 prize, and we had, as you can see here, we had more than 820 data scientists enrolled all throughout the whole entire African continent. The interesting thing is that Zindi has more than 12,000 African data scientists in its network. It's a fantastic source of knowledge already. And at the moment, we are busy writing up the results of this challenge, because we wanted to see over time how the participants improved their designs, their programming offerings, and we also surveyed them in terms of their work within Africa and their perceptions of how it is to work as a data scientist across Africa. And the reason why we launched this data science competition as well, and I refer on the slide, there are in this bullets a number of other challenges. There's been a lot of challenges that have actually been done using AI in Africa. So, for instance, there was a competition to make flood prediction in Malawi. So you can take data from the meteorological services, from satellites, etc., and you can build an app that can help the farmers in Malawi with flood prediction. It was also done for a COVID vulnerability map for South Africa. An urban air pollution challenge was done. So there's lots of applications, and also applications for tuberculosis via X-rays, etc. And all of these things led to very practical type of solutions. So this really showed me that there is the entrepreneurship, but also the talent that one find in Africa for these type of applications. Now, if we just look at the dynamics of how the entrepreneurs are taking these technologies, we have, from instance, data from the World Bank. They argue that there are now more than 314 tech hubs across Africa. Some of the other indications are that there are even more. In any case, if we look at some of the data that we do have on venture capital going into African tech startups, you can see that it's growing exponentially in the last couple of years. If somebody says, well, a lot of these entrepreneurs are really in slow growing firms that are not very dynamic, that don't create a lot of employment. Well, think again, this is a very good scientific study that was published in Small Business Economics Journal already 10 years ago. And this actually showed that the number of high growth firms in Africa compares very favorably to Germany, Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, etc. Right? And also equivalent to that of the USA. So the average number of high growth firms in the African sample of these authors were that 5.9% of firms in Africa were high growth firms. Right. So that's again, I think a misunderstanding that firms in Africa are not successful and are not growing very fast and are really doing bad. We are so much confronting this negativity in terms of the news, and that I think it's good that we sometimes share the good findings. The same is happening with digital platforms. So it's a new type of business model that is really, being characterized by using artificial intelligence very intensely in its business model. You can see there now that the biggest digital platform in Africa is Jumia. It's also now listed on the New York Stock Exchange. It's one of the first, what they call unicorns from Africa. But there you see also the number of users per platform now, and it's growing exponentially in Africa from, e-hailing, logistics, rental services, online shopping, freelancing, etc. That there is really a large growth. And you can see that it's at the moment it's concentrated in Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, but it's also taking place and spreading elsewhere. And I think with a free trade agreement in Africa, this will give further impetus to these type of digital platforms spreading. Interesting thing that I also recently explained to some of my to a government department in South Africa was that South Africa still thinks that its biggest companies are gold mining companies or it's Sasol producing chemicals and oils, but the most valuable company in South Africa is Naspers, which is a digital platform company. So we very quickly see once these digital platforms take root in Africa, they become very, very large and they can be very successful. So certainly we see this changing narrative if we increasingly look at what's reported into the national press slowly, but surely we find that there's talk about Africa's take gold rush, Africa's top entrepreneurs, while Africa is on the verge of an internet boom. Investors are hungrier than ever for African startups. So it's I think it's time that the narrative change. And at this stage, I think it's good to stop and to ask Jacques to continue on this note, to give us a little bit more of his practical experience in working with AI in manufacturing. Over to you.
Yes, can I share my screen as well?
You should be able to share.
I see it. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, there's so many things that resonate in terms of what you're saying there. I'm going to try and comment on that quickly in my presentation as well. So let me just, here we go. Okay, so very briefly, obviously the focus here is on manufacturing. So I think what's also relevant, I just last year, and I will just share a few things here. I did a keynote at the MIIA International, which is the Manufacturing Enterprise Solutions Association, and it was about making manufacturing great again. It's about the rise of Phoenix. That was kind of the theme last year, and I was specifically talking about operational AI to help manufacturing businesses thrive. And I was referencing some of the specific things. So what I want to do here is just to talk about specific examples and also my own business. we're also involved in that, although the focus is right now on health and financial wellness and building these digital platforms that Wim was talking about. So I'll mention a little bit about that. But my previous AI company that I sold to General Electric in 2011 was absolutely focused on the manufacturing mining industry, and we've developed software, minerals, metals mining, or AI engine for the minerals, metals mining manufacturing industry that we sold globally across the globe, and we provided solutions around that. And I'll share a bit of those examples as well. So in this particular presentation, I was kind of highlighting, this is just my massive transformative purpose around how to shape a better future in the smart technology era. That's why I'm also writing this book on democratizing AI to benefit everyone. And I will quickly reference some of the things that's happening in Africa that's really tied with that mission, that massive transformative purpose. And I also agree with Wim in terms of he's talking about, is there really a fourth industrial revolution? I call it the smart technology era. It's really part of the digital revolution. I do comment about this quite a bit and give perspectives and do some sense making around this topic in the book as well. But the one thing is for sure, the speed of technology change in a lot of instances is exponential. And a lot of the things that Wim mentioned there in terms of all those little building blocks that you can put together to actually very quickly leapfrog and provide solutions and disrupt industries, all of that is available, and it's opening the doors for everyone in the world, but definitely in Africa as well. And it's really the fusion of these smart technologies that allows you to do very powerful things. So it's about creativity. Do you have knowledge about this smart technology toolbox, how to apply it, how to use it? But we are democratizing that. There's lots of examples of that. So I'm quite excited about what can be done in this regard. I'm just going to go, this is just talking about the smart technology era and AI as an exponential technology within this. As we instrument the world, as we generate more data, obviously we are providing more opportunities for AI and smart technology to actually unlock value, and specifically business value, but also societal value. And I talk about this also in the book. Specifically in terms of Cortex, and what I want to just quickly reference, this is my AI company, next generation AI company that's really, it's got an AI engine for business, but we've focused this whole thing now on financial, building a scalable digital platform for health and financial wellness. I'll just mention that briefly, but I want to focus on the manufacturing side for now. So I'll show some examples. So the way we're looking at this, so basically, if you think about AI technologies and solutions in general, there's the customer-facing world. And Wim talked about recommendation engines and the personalization that you do, all these customer services. We think about the retail sector, in terms of what Amazon is doing, Netflix is doing, all of that. So there's the personalization and that engagement that's happening where AI is applied at large scale. But then on the industrial side, the manufacturing side, it's not only that, but it's actually the enhancing and sensing that's happening. So you can build models not only of customer behavior, but also obviously of processes, of assets and so forth. And then you can detect if there's anything going wrong. What is real-time causes for that? You can start optimizing around that. You can build security solutions. But then because of the types of data that we generate, we can do a lot more with geospatial data, audio data, vision, and all of that, and obviously IoT, and all of that provides us with great opportunities to unlock value. And that's exactly what we've done. So I just want to quickly share another slide here that talks about that. This was actually on health wellness, but I want to go to just to this particular slide that shows this. So this is just some of the recent solutions here in South Africa and Africa. And one of them is, that I want to just highlight, is a minerals, metals mining solution. And it's typical of the types of solutions that we've provided globally as well. So, but this one specifically, it was one of the biggest companies in the world, mining companies in the world, where we've done AI-driven automation of their mining operations to increase revenue, reduce risk. And we were not only looking at that side, but even looking at the supply chains and modeling that side of it as well, and looking at the impact of COVID-19 on their business from that perspective as well. But on the industrial side, is really about how can you increase the throughput, the yield, how can you reduce the risk, and that's a huge application area. What I want to quickly just go back here to manufacturing. So I just want to quickly show specific examples. So some of the core AI use cases per sector, clearly, if you look at manufacturing, it's around predictive maintenance. And one of the big reasons why General Electric acquired my first AI company was because of their assets. And they're also involved in industrial processes. But we've provided an engine, a solution, an AI solution that allows you to be predictive in terms of maintenance. And you can also look at your asset performance and also your utility optimization. So those are three very important ones. But there's also chemical or manufacturing process that you can start optimize. And the other example, and I will get to that shortly, well, maybe I should just quickly go there. I just want to quickly show this as well. So if you think about any minerals, metals, mining, industrial process, the opportunities are to build models of a process, of a piece of equipment, and then start troubleshooting that. The moment you've got a model, you've got something powerful. You're going to extract knowledge and you can understand the causes of variation. And if you look at any of these kind of industrial applications, it all has to do with the KPIs. What do you want to control? You don't want runaway temperatures in a furnace, for instance. What is the underlying causes for that? So you want to understand the distribution, you want to understand the causes of variation, you want to then reduce that variation, and then you want to actually improve, you want to then diagnose and then predict and then control and optimize. And this is exactly the same recipe that we've done not only in Africa, but also across the globe in multiple industries, in discrete manufacturing, continuous manufacturing, batch manufacturing, but also in minerals, metals, mining, other types of industries as well. And this kind of little thing here at the bottom also shows some of the things. It's about equipment availability. So that will increase production. You want throughput and quality increase. You want to reduce your risk. So that's typically in terms of process and equipment failure. And you also want to reduce your cost in terms of energy, raw material usage, and so forth. So there's plenty of areas. And these are specific examples where we've increased, we've stabilized the grinder plant. This is like a manufacturing plant. We increased the throughput with 5%. And it was the feed rate going into this grinder was all over the place. You can see the variation. And just by applying machine learning, AI, understanding the process, understanding the causes of variation, you can actually improve that and reduce that variation and then get a better feed rate. And that maximizes throughput, that improves the grind quality. It lowers also the energy. So this translates to millions of dollars straight away. And then just piece of equipment. If you think about trucks and all these kind of things, you just want to increase the availability. So this is an example of where we increase it from 70% to 85%. That again translates to millions of dollars. So these are industrial industry examples of where one can make a huge difference. And there's lots of other examples in terms of Sense, the intelligent video analytics for safety monitoring, security monitoring, transport, logistics, mining, and many other types of things where one can add value. I'm not going to go into too much in the interest of time here. Wim, do I have a few minutes still?
Yes, we still do have a few minutes, Joe.
Okay, great. Because I just wanted to quickly talk, because I can talk more about manufacturing in general and things that one can do to actually generate business value. But I also just want to quickly reference just some of the things that's happening in Africa, just some initiatives. Now, Wim talked about Zindi and stuff, and I'll quickly talk about that. Also, Data Science Nigeria. John talked about ACE. And let me just quickly reference that as well. So I'm just going to skip a few things. So there's incredible AI opportunity for Africa now. It was very interesting, Wim's perspectives there. And it was interesting, John saying in terms of investment, but I think if you look at the stats that Wim has provided there, it's clear there are great investment. Even my own company, we've got some huge investment, and we're also building towards unicorn type of platform businesses. I'm very excited about those kind of things. And we do have some success stories here. For instance, Seasoned Systems that was sold to General Electric. That was a huge early success story in terms of AI. But on the broader scale, it is so that if you compare what's happening in Africa to what's really the money investment happening globally, it is really relatively less. So it's obviously we can do a lot more. So the massive transformative purpose is really around how can we shape that better future, how can we help business and society thrive. And that's what we're building here with AI communities, with the Machine Intelligence Institute of Africa, with Data Science Nigeria, with Zindi, and all these kind of initiatives. So we need to build capacity. Now, in Cortex, we've really focused on I think one of the important things in Africa, apart from the infrastructure, is education is huge. But then also health wellness and financial wellness and the unbanked, and how do you empower people from that perspective. So for us, that is a huge focus. On the MIIA front, it's really about transforming Africa through AI communities. And I just want to quickly, here I mentioned some of the partners, and you'll see Zindi there, and we engage with Swiss Cognitive and various other organizations. There you see Data Science Nigeria, and Wim also talked about the Volkswagen Stichting and what we're doing with AI quality. There's some really fantastic initiatives. I'm not going to go into details here, but I just wanted to make you aware of one of the organizations, MIIA specifically, that's looking at building a collaborative, impactful African AI ecosystem and to help transform Africa. And there's many things that one can do, and there's many other organizations that's helping with this. So we're just trying to support that as well. Like we are very actively involved in supporting ACE in Kenya, for instance, and Data Science Nigeria. But there's in Ghana great activities. There's in other communities also great stuff going on. But we do have opportunities to also disrupt the way you actually certify and accredit AI-related skills and so forth. So we've got some very specific ideas in terms of that, and growing the community, and also helping to validate and advise on ethical, robust, and trustworthy AI. There's lots of stuff on that, but how do you make it real and practical for real-world implementations as well? So we are applying this in our own business, but what's happening with other businesses. Now, ACE is an example of a smart technology center of excellence that was created in Kenya recently. That's obviously supported by MIIA as well. And we need more of these kind of things to build capacity. So anyway, I'm not going to go into much more detail there. There's some very specific goals associated with that. And I just wanted to show a little bit of the ecosystem, and I just want to reference one or two things just to show you some of the things that's happening to build that capacity and infrastructure. So here you can see Data Science Nigeria that I've mentioned, Zindi that was that Wim talked about, but Google has invested quite a bit as well with the Google Deep Learning Indaba. So even as from a Cortex perspective, we've invested also in some of the local Google Learning Indaba events. But this thing is an African-wide thing, and it's amazing what Google helped to do here with Deep Learning Indaba. So I encourage you to look at Indaba X with Deep Learning Indaba to see what's going on there. But there's also obviously a bunch of universities that's getting the act together now in terms of AI, machine learning, providing courses, even Stellenbosch University, where I was affiliated with them as well. And they've been doing some great stuff, University of Cape Town, University of Johannesburg, Pretoria. There's a bunch, and WITS as well. WITS is actually also linked to CIRRUS, which is AI Africa initiative, and I'll just talk quickly about that. But there's a bunch of tech hubs, incubators in Africa, which is very exciting, and it's happening across the continent. So I just want to quickly mention CIRRUS as well. So CIRRUS is a whole private sector led initiative that brings together academia. We've got Stellenbosch and we've got WITS and a few universities in Africa involved with this as well, but also industry. And the aim is to build world-class AI research and application capability and to enable this kind of transformation in scientific research and commercialization. So this is the aim here. And it consists of a cooperation program. There's state-of-the-art computing infrastructure that we don't have yet. We've got some computing available here locally, obviously via the cloud. There's quite a bit that's made available. But in terms of local computing infrastructure, this is what CIRRUS aims to put in place here. And then open learning. There's also Foundry Fund and Foundry that looks at startups and so forth. As well. And there's more details. If you go to CIRRU's website, you will find more details about what's involved here. The other thing I wanted to mention is just Data Science Nigeria. I think they are setting an example of how to build capacity, a data science capacity in Africa. So MIIA initially, a few years ago, started supporting Data Science Nigeria. I was spending personally some time there, doing some boot camps, speaking at some conferences. And here is Bayo Kanvi. He's the Chief Transformational Officer of MTN, and he was the inspirational guy behind Data Science Nigeria. But now it's a whole community. And it's just awesome, the example that they are setting. So you can go to Data Science Nigeria to see what's happening there, their vision, the platforms that they're building, and so forth. I'm not going to talk more about Zindi, but Zindi, I'm very excited about this. MIIA has also supported Zindi, and also with VIMS and the whole collaboration. This has been a fantastic success story for Africa as well. And I think I would probably want to stop there. The rest of it is a bit more specific ideas that I had proposed 4 or 5 years ago in terms of smart technology, centers of excellence, how to build this capacity, and how to actually grow this. It's actually a fourth industrial revolution, or say smart technology era entrepreneurship ecosystem, and how can you link it with universities, and how you can actually create this mesh structured network of collaboration across Africa and beyond. Anyway, so lots of stuff on that regard. I think I'm probably going to end there. I do have more things to obviously talk about, but Wim, I don't know if there's any questions on both our presentations.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Yes, I think we still have about 15 minutes in this session that I think remains, and we can use that for questions and answers. And maybe if some of the questions you can refer back to your slides. But thank you very much, Jacques, and also thank you again to the audience for listening to us. So as mentioned, we do have some time for discussion. So if there are any questions, Jacques and I would be very happy to try and answer them.
Yeah, very, very fascinating contribution. A lot is happening and much more can be expected, I think. Now, you continuously mention a few hub countries or hub areas where this is happening. South Africa, it's Kenya, it's Rwanda, it's Nigeria. You never mentioned the links with North Africa, and particularly what's happening in Morocco. Are there any connections between these hubs in the parts of Africa you mentioned and the developments in the north? And what else is happening elsewhere in Africa, particularly in the university setup in the rest of Africa?
I can maybe just quickly comment. So Morocco, there's some really good stuff happening there as well. As a matter of fact, at the Data Science Nigeria event, I was there, but there was also an AI company from Morocco that was there and doing some great work. So at least that the support of Data Science Nigeria brought kind of North Africa and Southern Africa together. So we were exposed to what they are doing and so forth. But Tony, I agree. I think we can do a lot more to connect better, to work, to collaborate more better. I think it's very early days in terms of this still, and incredible opportunities to work better together. I think there's a natural inclination between Southern Africa, Western Africa, and Eastern Africa. There's definitely a link, but we are missing kind of that Northern Africa thing. So a connection. So we can do more in that regard. Wim, I don't know if you want to comment.
No, I agree with you, and I also agree with Tom's observation. I think that there is that we see also in the current trade groupings. There's a natural type of already, because there are already trade links and business links between different regions of Africa, and we know that for historical reasons, for instance, East Africa and West Africa have not been so strongly connected. Also the roads. If you want to take a shipping container from Kenya to Nigeria, you take it by sea around Cape Town. You don't take it by road directly from Kenya to Nigeria. That's the old example, and similar for the Sahel and the Sahara. Deconnecting the Northern African countries. But I think these things are changing. As Jacques mentioned, there are already activities. I also know that in Tunisia, and Southern Africa and South Africa, there are increasing collaborations on, for instance, in trade, big data. So I've been involved in one exercise with Tunisia and South Africa where we looked at the big data in terms of trade and logistics, because Tunisia is actually, in terms of distance, very well located towards big markets in Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. So yes, these type of activities, I think, are important to continue to develop.
And my question about the universities, because what you see is that the number of universities is increasing rapidly. There's also a great rise of the number of private universities. And can you see that the attention for machine learning, for AI, etc., in universities is more now a matter of the private universities taking it up? Or can you see that the established universities or the newer public universities also take this on?
I think it's my experience so far. It's been very selective where they take it on. And it was kind of, for me, I would expect that even Stellenbosch University or University of Cape Town to be kind of more at the forefront, but they are getting the act together. There's a School of Data Science and Computational Thinking that was launched last year. I was there at the launch and event. And they do have some postgrad courses in AI, machine learning, and so forth. From a MIIA side, we're also supporting that heavily. But you're absolutely right. One of the reasons I founded the Machine Intelligence Institute of Africa was because there was nothing happening. What's going on here? And you can see the world this whole decade that we've just been past. You see incredible explosion. You see all this wonderful stuff happening. Where's the research? Where is the applications? But it's almost like I think things have woken up a little bit. So I see definitely an upward curve. But we can accelerate that. We should do more. It's huge gap, Tom. I think you're so right. It's, but at least for me, it's just good to see the positive things. But it's very selective, and there also a little bit of collaboration. Also with we are also partnered with the Nelson Mandela Institute in Kenya. That obviously via John's connections there. So I'm very much linked with him as well on that front. But I still feel it's more kind of local. Even in South Africa, I don't see super collaboration as well. So I think we're our own biggest enemies. We should think about the bigger picture here and see what we can do and how can we build capacity and learn from one another and move forward. But anyway, I'm talking about this kind of thing in the book as well. I think we got to think about the big picture thinking here. And
I think there are to add, Jacques, to Tom's question also about universities. I think yes, Tom, the universities should be investing more in STEM type of education and training. That is a big need, and that is not forthcoming as it is, and that is why we see that the private sector is providing a lot of the most cutting edge activities in AI in Africa. We have actually seen that with the mobile phone revolution as well. The fixed landlines was bypassed by the private mobile phone industry because the governments just couldn't get their act in order to distribute fixed landlines fast enough. There was too much, you needed permissions to do any innovations, and any investments in fixed landlines was just too difficult to do. But the gap in terms of regulation existed in mobile, and the private sector just took it and continued. And I think we see a little bit of that indeed taking place in AI now. So I'm really thinking the university should be doing that. I've also tried, from Europe to make linkages between African data centers and African universities and European universities. So, but for some reason, I'm running into walls there. I've tried to get the best data science and AI institutes in the Netherlands to work together with African institutes, and it's not working. And there doesn't seem to be funding available, from the Dutch side, from the government development program as well, especially not in the business of AI. In the Netherlands, there's lots of money available for computer scientists and so on for AI. But if you want to apply that into companies and diffuse the AI, well, there's no real programs available to help that type of diffusion. In fact, if you look at the TRIPS agreement in terms of the agreement in terms of patents and intellectual property and technology, in the Netherlands, the flow of technology in terms of its development cooperation has actually declined. I think, in fact, the last 2 years, the Netherlands didn't even, and I'm talking under correction, but I think at least in 2018, when I looked, it didn't even submitted a report in terms of its TRIPS commitment. So we do see, still a lot of resistance in the advanced economies to actually put their put their words into actions in terms of helping the diffusion of technology to developing countries. So this is one thing that the universities are grappling with. The other problem from the public point of view, in my view, and Jacques to also add to this, is that the statistical agencies in Africa have not really geared themselves for the big data revolution. I can remember I was the former South African Minister Trevor Manuel appointed me to the Council of Statistics South Africa back in 2005. And this was just when we were on the cusp of the big data revolution, which took place in 2007, 2008, the launch of the Apple iPhone, YouTube, etc. And we were already at that stage grappling with the fact that the budgets of statistical agencies were being slashed. And they were still doing things in the old-fashioned way. They were sending out, enumerators with questionnaires to houses and getting information, not from scanners and from digital sources, but from really old sources. And this, I think, should also change, because fundamentally, if you want to drive the AI also in universities, if you have this public data available, that would really support the researchers to do something from that. So we do have this public, type of challenges that would make it a lot better, as John said, to overcome the skills and data gaps.
Can I say something? I can't find the hand button.
Okay, and then I'll come back to Madeleine. Doreen?
Yeah, well, Marie-Louise and I are both from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Of course, I joined as a private researcher. I want to state that very clearly. But it's true that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is now catching up on all the digital developments and how we should implement that in foreign politics, also geopolitical consequences, the trade consequences, and the whole idea of development and digitalization. So there is a strategic part of the ministry who is really closely looking into that currently, and they're also bringing that up to the senior management of the ministry. And of course, one of the conclusions is that the whole of government is still not prepared. We don't really have a focal point on high tech and digitalization within the entire government. So even in the Netherlands itself, we are struggling with it. And I think Marie-Louise knows more about how to apply it more in development cooperation work. I do think there was a big grant to Miriam de Bruin on ICT in Africa. So there are some research fundings from the Dutch government, but it's true that we're still catching up, and even though we have a lot of strategy papers now, we're still not entirely sure how we're going to implement that in all our different policy areas.
Okay.
Maybe Marie wants to say something about that.
Madeleine, your hand was up.
Yeah, hello. I'm actually Sabato. I'm the brother, okay. But that's fine. It's just the wrong name there. I'm Sabato. I'm a bachelor student in Austria for artificial intelligence. And my dad is actually from the Ivory Coast. So I have family there, and I keep getting questions about, hello, can you help me to study IT or artificial intelligence in Europe? And because you were saying that there are more and more universities and there is a lot happening in Africa, I was wondering if this is really also getting through to the youngers, to the children, because a lot of times I feel like that there is still the feeling that, I have to go to Europe, I have to go to the US to study and to be successful. And I don't feel like there is really it really went through to the youngest of the population that you maybe don't have to go that far, but you just look inside your own country or in your neighboring country, and you might get the education that you're looking for.
Absolutely. I just want to quickly comment on that. If I even look at my son, he's going to go to university now, and just the information that's available on the internet, what Google provides. If you think about AI machine learning stuff, there's some incredible courses. If you go to Google Colab, for instance, or you look at Coursera and so forth. So I think it has been democratized already. You can see in terms of it's accessible, and you don't need to go elsewhere to do this. So are the children aware of it? I think we should actually maybe do a better job of just showing them where all the resources are and what's available. I think there's quite a bit there. So my son is fortunate because I'm guiding and I'm showing him stuff, but how can we democratize that? How can we make that at scale available so that people can have that. But again, if you think about the internet infrastructure, all of that is also important as part of that. So if you don't have access to the internet, you don't have access to knowledge. And the moment you open up that, you remove that barrier, it opens up tremendous opportunities. And that's why it's important from an African perspective. Education, it's so untapped, the potential that's there. If we just fix that problem. So just guiding people in terms of where to look, what to do. It's almost like that filtering, and then also the sense making around what's available. And because people spend time on social media and all sorts of other different things, but they can spend the time also on things that's more educational and more uplifting, and then helping building values and character and skills and so forth as well. So I think we should try and emphasize that and bring that into the curriculums, into the schools, so that people see what's available out there. But anyway, it's a gap, it's a problem.
But what I also want to emphasize is we should not. It is important that people travel. It's important for Africa's youth to get out of Africa and travel across the world and be global citizens, right? And learn from the rest of the world. That's the way in which technology and new ideas spread across the world. There's a lot of technology and ideas that are tacit knowledge that you cannot codify and just read a book how to do that. And that is very important. Also the networking. So I encourage African youngsters to go abroad. The important thing is also, over time to go back and plow their knowledge and expertise back into the continent. Now, I just mentioned, in my presentation, Naspers, the biggest digital platform in Africa, who owns, 30% of Tencent, one of the biggest Chinese digital platforms, which created Mnet. How did that happen? Well, I met the CEO at some time, and he told me, in the 1970s, he left South Africa to study at Columbia University. He did his MBA in the United States. And there he got the idea. And so he went back and he sold it in South Africa, and he built the biggest digital online platform in Africa. I have many of these stories talking to African entrepreneurs. And what we see at the moment happening as well is that Y Combinator, it's the biggest accelerator in the United States. It's where Airbnb and Uber and Tesla and all these companies got their startup funding from. They are going to Africa now. They have competitions in Africa. They are taking the best and the brightest of entrepreneurs with ideas to Silicon Valley. And then they give them funding and they go back into Africa. So I like these type of things. Now, my worry is that with COVID, there'll be kind of like maybe a deglobalization, and people will say, well, I can stay in Africa and I can study with a university or a school in New Zealand. That's, by the way, happening. I've heard that there are New Zealand schools who are having school children from African countries doing their online international, education, from a school in New Zealand. So we are going to see the digital online learning being cheaper and being more effective, which has the temptation that you can sit in any country in Africa and you can study with international institutions more cheaply than in the past. But I would still encourage, my view is that you still need that personal interaction. So we should not be rolling back, restrictions on travel should not become more stronger. We should actually be more critical about the existence of borders and about the freedom of people to travel across the world. And that government should be competing for high-skilled people, not the other way around. The people should not be serving their governments, but the government should be serving their people.
I absolutely agree. I think a balanced perspective is so important here. And if I even look at myself, a lot of the inspiration and things that I got was traveling internationally, globally and stuff, and plowing back. So that's the story that resonates absolutely. So I agree with that. I think it's all a balance. But what's incredible for me personally, even though I didn't travel a lot last year, probably not a lot of people traveled a lot of stuff being cancelled. I think exposure to, if you think about YouTube, you think about podcasts, Clubhouse, for instance, all these new initiatives where you can plug in and listen to some of the greatest minds with just by clicking, going to YouTube, going to, say, Lex Fridman or Joe Rogan, or you go to the Intellectual Dark Web, or do a Clubhouse. Elon Musk was speaking on Clubhouse, and you listen. There's all these kind of initiatives that just opens the door to other people's thoughts, and that is at least a way to learn and see what's happening and kind of be exposed to other thinkings and cultures and so forth as well. But that's not a substitute for traveling and stuff like that. So I think it's a balance, and so I fully agree with you. I know what it meant for me.
Well, I think we have reached the end of the session. We are just past 12 o'clock. So for me, I would like to ask maybe a final round of applause for all the presenters and for the discussion and questions as well. It's been really an honor and a privilege for me, as well as on behalf of Jacques and John. We had the conceptualization of this idea, and we are also very grateful to Ton for also seeing some merit in the ideas that we had to share this on the platform that the African Studies Center offered us. So thank you, Ton. Thank you very much for that. We are very proud and very happy with the conference that has been organized. It would have been fantastic, if we could have done it without COVID in presence, but it's still fantastic the way that it's been organized. There's also tonight, as part of the rich offering of the conference, a movie on Everything Must Fall. Jacques mentioned Wits University today. Tonight you can watch the movie at 8 o'clock and also see how the students are really demanding, their rights and their education. I think very inspirational. It resonates a little bit with what I also see happening with entrepreneurs, just taking the technology and doing things, irrespective of the obstacles that they face. So please do watch the movie tonight if you can make it. Ton, and again to all the speakers, Doreen, Peter, Paul, to all the people who ask questions and make this a very nice and lively session, I thank you all very much. Let's also use this to network afterwards, contact one another via email or whatever, means if there are follow-up questions or information. And also, hopefully, the positive thing from Marie-Louise and Doreen's feedback is maybe we can encourage the Dutch government to do more in terms of the transfer of knowledge in AI and data science to African universities, African schools, and the like. I certainly see this as a priority for Africa's future. So on my side, thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice afternoon. And Jacques, if you want to mention something as well, you can have the final word.
I just want to say thank you, Wim, as well, and thank you for all the participants, for everyone. Yeah, I think it was very enlightening, and it was refreshing, and it was interesting. I found all the presentations very interesting. So thanks very much. This is good. We should do more of this. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye.